Welcome to Firewise in the Classroom, Chapter 5, Minnesota Wildland Fire History. In the last 200 years, Minnesota has had three very destructive fires. The Hinckley Fire of 1894, the Moose Lake Fires of 1918, and the Blowdown Fires from 2006 to 2011. You'll notice that the second and third items listed there were actually collections of fires. These most destructive fires had several things in common. There were persistently hot and dry conditions. There was a significant drop in humidity. That means the air became drier. A change in wind direction or increase in speed, and a large expanse of cured fuels ready to burn. This is a headline of one of the papers discussing the Moose Lake fires. Communities were not equipped to fight wildland fire. They were barely equipped to fight structure fires in their towns. This is a photograph of a typical fire brigade, consisting of a long hose reel pulled either by a team of horses or by a truck, men with absolutely no safety gear, and very common tools like a shovel or an axe or a gunny sack. You can imagine trying to fight fires in the forest with this equipment would be pointless. This is a map of the fires of 1918. As you can see here, there were many fires, not just one. In fact, over 50 of them within a span of a couple of days. And these fires, as they burned, merged into one another, forming what we call a mega fire. High school students will now be watching an 8-minute video clip on the fires of 1918. Younger students should avoid this clip and again skip ahead to the next few slides describing how those fires unfolded. Make sure you turn to Chapter 5 in your student user guide and fill out questions about one of the fires.
Now we continue to head north to the Cloquet-Moose Lake area, where the worst natural disaster in state history hit in 1918. Now we continue to head north to the Cloquet-Moose Lake area, where the worst natural disaster in state history hit in 1918.
Well, it was very wooded. Actually, one of the main industries here was logging. It was the second year of extremely dry summer, hot, dry summer. The humidity, they said, was about 20%, which is very unusual for this area with all the lakes around here. The loggers would take basically the good timber and leave the brush. And so, of course, it would get very dry. It would be tinder.
For every major fire, you have a sudden drop in humidity. And you have all this fuel on the ground, you know, from the logging companies.
October 12th, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit later in the fall. A little bigger population by 1918, a little more density in terms of numbers of people that were in danger.
But with a world war on, there were global concerns and a stringent state stance.
1918 was a terrible year. We were in the midst of a war. Minnesota itself was under the control of a five-man dictatorship, the Committee on Public Safety, which prevented any kind of negative publicity about the state or anything else through its censorship process.
So when the fire broke out, news coverage would not be as robust.
The negative consequences of the fire were kind of diminished to some extent by the Public Safety Commission. But more importantly, there was also the flu epidemic that took place at that time, and people were preoccupied with health concerns. So the fire, although disastrous, political liberties were under threat at that time. So look, a fire, what's a fire?
It's a fire, I guess, that personally means more to me because I know people who had gone through it. Both of my parents went through it. I grew up in northern Minnesota, a little store north of Cloquet, about 15 miles, called Burnett. That area was ran over by the fire in 1918. It wasn't just one fire, again, it was multiple fires, multiple starts. And as the day went on, many of these smaller fires merged into much larger fires.
The railroads got blamed for a great deal of it, and they were steam driven and fired either with wood or coal, so there were sparks. But it was just a whole combination of things that started the fire. Of course, we call it the Moose Lake Fire and we feel a little ownership because the greatest loss of life was from Moose Lake west of here. When it hit the shores of Moose Lake, it actually jumped from treetop to treetop across the lake because of the wind.
In the city of Moose Lake, many were able to seek refuge in the water and used their cars to try to outrun the wildfire.
The smoke was so intense and so thick that they couldn't see, and there were like 26 deaths right at that particular corner because they just would run into each other. My mother-in-law's family were fire survivors, 9 children and parents. And they lived about 2.5 miles west of town, and as they were coming into town and coming down the hill, she learned in Sunday school that when the end of the world came, the stars would fall out of the sky. And she saw all the sparks, and she was sure that this was the end of the world. It was so traumatic. She really never did talk about it at all, to me anyway, but she did write her story.
A lot of people did take shelter in lakes. I do know 3 individuals that took shelter in a river, and they were fortunate enough the fire passed over the top of them. It may not be in many cases the fact that the flames are killing an individual, but it would be, the superheated gases and the lack of oxygen that would be smothering people.
One family, the mom and father put all their 8 children in the root cellar and stayed outside throwing water on the wooden door to make sure that it wouldn't burn. Unfortunately, after the fire went by and they opened the door, all the children had suffocated because the fire took all the oxygen. Over 250,000 acres were burned. 35 towns were destroyed. 453 deaths occurred related specifically to the fire, and after the fire, another 106 people died.
A horrific loss of life. Many families lost. The intense heat to some depth, maybe down to 6 inches, sterilizes the soil. It kills every living organism in that top layer of the soil.
The worst
natural disaster in Minnesota history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it the worst natural
I believe it
disaster?
is.
An estimated 50 to 60,000 people were injured or displaced. I mean, can you imagine, a similar tragedy today? We don't have anything that comes close to rivaling that. And I think people were shocked. I can't think of a better word, that you could have that scale of a disaster. But all the ingredients converged. Again, it's thought that the railroads may have triggered as many as 50% of these fires.
There was one for sure that was actually blamed on the railroad. There were many lawsuits that were filed. The government actually owned the railroads at the time, so there wasn't an entity that they could sue. It was like into the 30s before it was paid out.
What do you think the impact is for the community? How do they remember this?
We still honor those people. And part of it, I think, is we honor them for their perseverance to rebuild.
And the Moose Lake Cloquet fire may have stomped out the remnants of the logging industry and move the region more towards mining.
Timbering, however, was petering out and was moving nationally toward the Pacific Northwest. At the same time, iron ore mining was becoming increasingly significant.
Despite wartime censorship, papers did publish Politicians' Pledge of Support.
Charles Lindbergh Sr. was running against Governor Burnquist for the Republican endorsement, for nomination actually. Politicians love disasters. I mean, look, no, they really don't, but they love it in terms, this gives them exposure. And for empathy and sympathy, each empathy and sympathy votes 10 votes, 5 votes, 15 votes.
Tremendous response, more so, I might add, than 1894 in terms of community and statewide response to recovery and rebuilding associated with that fire. It's no longer, as in, shall we say, 19th century jargon, every man for himself. It's like the community response to the 1918 fire and recovery from it was chapter 1, maybe an example of how a community goes about recovering from such a tragic event.
July 4th of 1999 was the biggest straight-line wind event in modern Minnesota history. It blew down millions of trees on the northern border with Canada. A large majority of this blowdown was within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. And all of this downed fuel began to die and then to cure. Various ignition sources started several large fires from 2006 to 2011 in the blowdown. This is a map produced by the U.S. Forest Service of the severity of the blowdown. You see the map is basically northeast Minnesota. Yellow areas are 10 to 33% blown down. Orange areas are 2/3 blown down. And the red areas are 67 to 100% blown down. All of the major Boundary Waters blowdown fires occurred in those areas of red. These are a few photographs taken a day or two after the blowdown event. You'll now be watching an 8-minute video clip about these blowdown fires. Both middle school and high school students are welcome to view.
Our final stop takes us way up north to a series of blazes around the Boundary Waters Canoe Area that happened in this century.
There's a whole chunk of land, water, that's really pristine, pure, clean, wonderful. Northern Minnesota, southern Canada. Environmentalists and conservationists had their eye on that, to preserve that. For that, we have to go back to Theodore Roosevelt. He starts a conservation movement, which was largely a very conservative movement. It's a movement really to conserve our natural resources. They started campaigning for that in the 1920s. In 1978, the boundary waters were not determined by Minnesota politics. The boundary waters were determined by national politics, by the votes in Congress. And it did pass overwhelmingly, actually.
Way back all the way to the 70s, the National Weather Service decided it needed to get quite serious about fire weather forecasting. And what they came up with was kind of an ingredients method for forecasting fire weather. First and foremost, it looks for dryness in the form of drought. Secondly, They look for daytime highs in the 80s and 90s, but with extraordinarily low relative humidities. And then lastly, they look for a low pressure system.
So 2 decades into its existence, the BWCA experiences a storm of the century.
The July 4, 1999 blowdown, done by maybe the most famous derecho, Spanish for straight line windstorm, to ever hit the state of Minnesota, cut a huge, wide swath of destruction.
I mean, there may have been literally 1 million or more trees blown down by that windstorm. Just an unimaginable amount of fuel on the forest floor, waiting for something to happen.
I'm a lead forecaster at the Weather Service office in Chanhassen, and that's my main job. Technology became advanced enough that we were able to deploy meteorologists or incident meteorologists, IMETs, on site. The big fires in Minnesota I've been on were started in 2006, with the Cavity Lake fire. And that seemed like the granddaddy. That was 35,000 acres roughly.
There was a campaign that went on for multiple years after that 1999 storm to come in and try to help mitigate some of that by cleaning up and cleaning out certain areas, not leaving quite so much fuel. But it was so mammoth in scale that it ended up, in my view at least, kind of being piecemeal.
What the Forest Service did, which is great foresight on their part, is they did quite a number of large prescribed burns. Well, the Cavity Lake fire was largely a blowdown fire. Cavity Lake fire was started by a lightning strike. The big runs are oftentimes 1 day or 2 days, but by the time you get a line drawn around that fire and you contain it and mop it up so that that fire isn't going to cause any problems anymore, it takes a considerable amount of time to do that. Actually, it was the largest fire in Minnesota since the 1918 fire.
Less than a year later, disaster strikes again.
Suddenly in May of 2007, not quite in the same area, but awfully close, we're fighting another fire.
It was totally different. So this was pretty unusual with how early it was. The ice had just gone off the lakes.
That one is unfortunately got the human fingerprint on it, doesn't it? Yeah.
And it was started by a campfire. 76,000 acres by the time Ham Lake got done. It's a huge fire by modern times. There were 100 structures that were burnt between the U.S. and the Canadian side.
So the human impact of the Ham Lake fire is the biggest. But the BWCA blazes of the 2000s were not done yet.
Pagami fire started with a lightning strike, 18th of August. The weather continued to get warmer, continued to get drier, fuels continued to get drier, and then the fire started making a push towards the southeast. I was called that evening, the 11th of September. Got up there the 12th, around noon, about the time it started making its 16-mile run.
That was left to sort of a watch and see situation, which in the end I think most people feel was probably a mistake. Because when Mother Nature fired up her weather engine a bit later on, she really fired it up big time. That one really got out of hand and blew up. I mean, I think that's the proper word. It really blew up on people. In the modern context, when something like that happens, shame on you. I mean, you know, with the way we fight fires these days, something like that shouldn't happen, but unfortunately sometimes it does.
93,000 acres was the final tally, and about 60,000 of that was in one afternoon, for about 5 hours. So 3 major fires, Cavity Lake, Ham Lake, and Pagami in a span of about 5 years. So it's been pretty incredible.
We need to approach the North Woods with a renewed sense of humility and understand that in spite of all of our technology, all of our knowledge, we are going to have major fires. There's nothing we can do to prevent them. I know it's counterintuitive, but fire has a positive impact on the forest. It has a fertilizing effect. And in many cases, extreme heat releases seeds that go on to grow future trees, future shrubs, future flowers.
Even beyond its regenerative effect, ultimately, fire teaches us all indelible life lessons.
We're never going to eradicate fire. And on some level, we don't want to eradicate fire because it is part of nature. It's a little like trying to control tornadoes or control flooding. Good luck. You know, we can try to keep people out of harm's way. The more I study fire, the more humble I am as a meteorologist, how difficult it is to predict and how impossible it is to control. I mean, we are more than any other natural phenomenon. We are at the mercy of Mother Nature.
This is the end of Chapter 5, Minnesota Fire History.